The year was 1976. There was riots in the street. Thatcher had gotten in, and overall there was employment and dole. The music that was in the charts was miles away from the feeling on the street. Disco, prog, and loads of others. But suddenly, out of the shadows of these dark times would come a music that would unite and define a generation. And that music was called punk. It is well documented how punk impacted working class Britain and gave the youth of that point a voice. Facing off against the right-wing establishment rebelling, you had bands like The Clash, The Damned, and the Sex Pistols, to name a few. But one place that doesn't seem to be very well documented is Scotland. We had great bands like the Skids, the Rosillos, and in the 80s we had loads of bands, even way into the 90s. But no one ever seems to report this. I wanted to find out more, so I dug into my contacts and found a few people that I thought I'd interview. So this is the story of a punk. For my first interview, I'm going to be interviewing Mr. Alex Aiken, who was in the legendary ska punk band Cathedra. During our conversation, I asked Alex many things, like what was the Glasgow punk scene like back in the day, what bands did he play in, some political issues, and what he thinks of the Glasgow punk scene now. So I suppose the first question I would have would be, how did you get into the Scottish punk scene?
Well, I was 14 when punk came out in 77, and I was still at school, and me and some school friends, like I heard the Stranglers. I can remember hearing the Stranglers' Peaches, and then reading about the Sex Pistols, but it was a while before I realised that there was an actual thing happening.
Yeah.
I just thought it was new bands, and then I realised there was a whole scene, and I was at school, and most folk hated it. I mean, there was only like literally a handful of people that got it. Most people hated it with a vengeance, and you got a lot of hassle back in the day for the way you looked. And but it was great times, you know. Just the music was fantastic, and I think at 14 years old, like hitting adolescence at the same time as punk, it just linked together and just blew me away. Great.
Yeah. Who were some of the bands around at the time in Scotland that maybe had an influence on you or that you first saw?
Well, the first local band that I remember went to see was a band from Shawlands in Southside called The Alleged. This is about 78. I was only 15, but we used to try and sneak into the pub. And sometimes you would, it depends if there was bouncers in the door.
Yeah.
But the Dooncastle pub in Shawlands had a basement called the Beer Keller, and that's where the bands played. And if there was no bouncers upstairs in the door, we would just walk in as quickly as possible and looking as inconspicuous. And if you could get down the stairs into the dark Beer Keller, you were normally all right, and you would just get someone to buy you a pint, you know. And that's the Alleged were they were kind of pop punk. They were a bit like the Undertones, the Buzzcocks, that kind of style. They did Clash covers and stuff. They weren't proper punk, hardcore punk. But for me, that was like seeing a real band, you know, an actual band close up that you could actually, you know, like when they finished their set, they would just come down and join the crowd for a drink. And it wasn't like, my only experience was seeing the Stranglers at the Apollo at a big stage, and then they would disappear to their dressing room or something or their hotel. So this local band thing just was another kind of epiphany for me, that, you know, you could be in, you know, people can be in bands, but they weren't like, you know, alienated from you. They were just normal people. There was a lot of bands from Paisley that were really good. Paisley kind of picked up in the punk thing quite quickly. There's my phone going there. There was the Mental Errors, the Fegs. What else? Defiant Pose. There's the whole scene in Paisley that was really good. And when I was a bit older, like 16, 17, I would go and see them as well. So yeah, there's quite a lot of local bands in the south side. I was too young for the actual scene because couldn't really get into pubs. It wasn't until I was, 16, 17 that I could actually go and see bands in pubs. But But definitely in the early days, the local bands were just like the Alleged and that. So I can't think what other bands there was. There was lots of bands at the time. There's a lot of bands that weren't really, you wouldn't call them punk now, but at the time, the music they played was kind of offbeat enough to be different from the mainstream.
Yeah.
So it came under the umbrella of like punk new wave, and it was great, because you could do whatever you wanted. It was more, the scene was more diverse then, and it all came under the punk umbrella. As long as you were different and had an attitude, you kind of were accepted. And it was later on it became more defined, like the '82 punk.
Yeah. What sort of band or maybe person that you first saw that made you think I could, make my own music, or I could, be in a band?
Well, I suppose it was the Sex Pistols.
Okay.
The riffs of, when I started playing guitar, I was like 16, 17, and their stuff was pretty, a lot of punk stuff was pretty easy to, once you'd learn basic chords, it was easy to try and play them. I grew up listening to Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, and that stuff was really much harder to play.
Yeah.
So when punk came out, it actually made you think, God, I can actually do this, and that's what I did. I kind of got a guitar, got it for £30, and I had a friend who taught me a couple of basic chords, and the rest I just tucked away myself and just tried to play along with records,
Yeah. And what was sort of like the first band or first sort of piece of music that you were involved in?
In what way?
Just either playing guitar or with a band, or
Oh, well, I played for years in my bedroom, just playing along with punk records. My first band was, I joined a band called the God Squad, which is a punk band from Glasgow, and I did my first gig in 1984. So the 4 years before that, I was just playing myself. I had a couple of friends that would come in, would maybe have a jam or something, but we weren't that good enough to actually play. Basically, I was just playing along myself in my bedroom, try to line my chops.
Yeah. And one thing I want to ask as well is, obviously you were in Cathedra. What was that like, being in that band?
Oh, it was brilliant. When I left the God Squad in the end of the 80s, I started a new band in 1990, 91, and I wanted to kind of do a kind of more, it was more kind of hardcore at the time. I wanted to do all the punk bands in the late 80s were kind of pure hardcore thrash.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of get back to that melodic stuff, but still punk, like the Ruts and the Clash and Stuff Little Fingers. So I met a few folk. I met a girl called Izzy who was busking a violin in Shawlands, and she said she played bass. And I had a friend who played drums, and then I met Andy through an advert, the singer.
Yeah.
And we jammed together, and I had some riffs made up, and then we got a set together. We obviously did lots of covers at the beginning, and then we just started playing gigs. And luckily in the 90s, the scene was really good in Glasgow. There's lots of good new bands coming up, and we just kind of joined in with that, It's great.
And what influence do you think Cathedra has made on the Scottish punk scene as a whole, or wider, or if they've made any influence?
Well, as I said, there was a whole scene of bands, and we all played gigs together and festivals and things, and we all kind of helped each other. We'd lend gear, we'd lend amps and stuff. We were quite lucky because we decided right early on that we weren't just going to play the local pub. We wanted to go out and start touring, and we met a guy. Luckily, we met a guy at Edinburgh. Edinburgh before the punks. It was a punks picnic in when was it, 94 or something, 93, 94. Maybe it was earlier than that, actually, 92. And we met this guy from Germany, and he said he would set up gigs for us.
Right.
So he actually started. Every country was linked. Belgium, Holland, Germany. They all had Scots, and they all had people that bands played in each other's countries. So there was a kind of network. So all you need to do was book a gig somewhere, get someone to book a gig in Germany. They would get in touch with someone in Holland, and then you'd end up with a tour. So we would go away on tour for like 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and we would just jump in the van with the gear, passports, and just drive off. It was quite naive. We didn't have any kind of insurance or any kind of confirmation or contracts. We just set off to the first gig, which was usually in England, to get us kind of petrol money to get abroad, and we would just set off, and that was it.
Because through the research that I've found, I'd seen a few sort of old posters where you guys had sort of supported, maybe not giant bands, but you'd supported the likes of Rancid and stuff like that. What was that like to play with bands?
Yeah, well, we were quite lucky because we would always try and get the support for all the good bands that were coming to town that we loved. The Rancid one was amazing because the first time they played was Nice and Sleazy in 1993, and it was a tremendous gig. And a time after that was the Garage, and then we got to know them, and Andy the singer got to know them, Lars, and I think he just asked either Lars or Tim we could support them next time they came. And the next time they came, they were playing like Parlanes and all that in the big venues. So we got the British tour, which was like, I think it was like 6 gigs or something. So we're playing the Parlanes, Brixton Academy, Nottingham Roxy, all these big venues. We went on first. They had a support band, which was the ska band, the All Star, Stubborn All Stars.
All right.
But we were allowed to play for the first. We had a 20-minute set, and the doors opened. But it was amazing. It was really good, and it was a good break for us.
Yeah. And then after Ex Cathedra, split, did you take some time to kind of figure out what you wanted to do next musically, or did you jump?
No, when Ex Cathedra split, basically Andy left, and the rest of us started a new band called Scunnered. And we got singer Rat from Machine Gun Etiquette.
Yep.
And we wanted to kind of do a more hardcore thing. There's a couple of probably skanky songs, but mostly we wanted to get away from that and do the kind of more intricate kind of hardcore stuff. So we did 2 albums with them, Scunnered, and I'm actually in the process of getting the 2 albums onto 1 CD, and I'm going to do a short run of 100 or something, because nobody really got a chance to get it. We only did about 100 copies, burned them ourselves, kind of thing. And everyone keeps asking about how can I get a copy. So I'm actually going to get a few done. So once that's done, I'll get in touch with you and get some out there.
Was it after Scunnered that you had joined Hateful?
Oh, well after, yeah. Scunnered only went for a couple of years because although we all loved it, we all wanted to do different things. And Jenny, the sax player, she moved to Australia. Stiff moved to Holland and joined Fleas and Lice. And Tommy started his own studio, and he wanted to do other stuff as well. So it was short-lived, but it was great. After Scunnered, I kind of had a break for a while. I was kind of drifting, and then Kiki kept saying, "Why don't you start a new band?" And then I found out there was some guys looking for a guitarist, and started a band called Crossfire. Don't know if you heard of them.
The name rings a bell.
We did 1 album. It was kind of more street punk, oi stuff.
Yeah.
Again, that's another album I need to try and get repressed because hardly anyone's got them. That was more street punk. Then I did. Again, that lasted a few years. After Crossfire, did the Bucky Skanks. I started playing bass. We started a band. Kiki was playing trumpet, and wanted to do a kind of dub reggae type thing.
Okay.
A bit like Citizen Fish kind of culture shock type stuff. And we did that for a while, but nothing really came of that. And then I played bass. I got another band called Decibel Freaks, where I played bass again. And then that's when I joined Hateful. So in between Crossfire and Decibel Freaks, I joined Hateful.
Yeah. And Hateful, when I saw them, and from what I always get from their music, is that they were very much, it wasn't about the 1 minute thrasher. It was about just making great melodic songs. Yeah,
very much. That's the whole ethos. It's not. They're more a kind of 70s rock punk band, classic. When you got Stuff Like Fingers, the Ruts, Generation X, that kind of classic rock punk rather than the hardcore. I mean, they did a few fast numbers, like most folk, but they tried to stay away from that shouty stuff because they went for the melodic stuff.
My final question would be, what do you think of the Scottish punk scene now? Do you think it's a lot more sort of healthier and wider and has a lot more people coming in?
Well, the Scottish punk scene, the Glasgow punk scene in recent years, it's had a lot of bother with the undesirables turning up to gigs and people being upset about that and a bit of a divide. So I think we need to get back to that, drawing a line in the sand and say, let's get these punk gigs on and just get good people at it and not have any kind of, undesirables at it.
Do you think there will ever be a way to sort of filter out these undesirable people that show up at the gigs?
Well, there is. If you have someone in the door that knows who they are, doesn't let them in. If you make clear from the start that you don't want these people at your gigs, and you just have to put your foot down, and say, like, we're not accepting this, So, hopefully we can get back to a good scene again where there's good bands and all good people in it.
Yeah. Well, Alex, thank you very much for this interview. It's been really informative.
No problem. Thanks for doing it. I'll talk to you soon. I'll maybe see you at a gig soon.
Yep, probably.
Right, cheers, Hamish.
Cool. See you then. Bye. The conversation I had with Alex helped me to kind of learn more about what it was like to be a Glasgow punk back in the day. But now, I want to go forward and go to Stirling. The next person I'll be talking to is a man by the name of Chris Lowe. When Chris was a young punk, he started hanging around with the Fakes. He soon started writing his own fanzines, and for a brief time was the drummer in Political Asylum. I spoke to him about the Stirling punk scene, what it was like, the punk scene in general, and other topics. Here's the interview. So my first question would be, how did you get into the punk scene / the Scottish punk scene?
That's a story in itself. Okay, right. Well, basically, you know Bridge of Allen, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know the youth centre in Bridge of Allen?
Slightly.
It just kind of faces onto the river. Well, the house I was brought up in overlooked the youth centre.
Right.
Right? And our next door neighbour was Jamesy, who was bass player in the Fakes.
Yep.
So, my first time I ever came across punk ever was I was in Stirling one time with my mum in the Thistle Centre. Actually, had the Thistle Centre even opened then? I think the Thistle Centre opened about 79. Would have been before, just in town, just in the centre of town, and just saw these kind of like mental looking punks. And it was, just round about then, I think that was literally that would have been 76, 77, because it was just a day or so after there'd been an Observer colour supplement or Times colour supplement feature on punk. So I'd never heard any punk songs. It was the first time I'd ever come into contact with it, and I saw them. And then obviously on the radio, you start hearing the songs, Plastic Bertrand, and you didn't really hear that many songs though, you know what I mean? So it was didn't really actually hear that many songs. But then we used to go skateboarding in the youth centre. And there was one day when we saw, there were these guys, there was a guy, Graham Chalk, Guy Grieve? You know Guy Grieve?
Yeah, I know Guy.
Aye, he's a sound guy. Well, him and Graham Chalk and a couple of other laddies, they had a band called Chaos, like Kaos. So we were just kind of like mucking about on our skateboards and everything. And they were like rehearsing in the youth centre. And I can't really remember much about it. I remember they had a song called Factory Man or something, which is a wee bit like the Fakes kind of production sort of thing. But that was like the first time I'd ever seen any kind of like, punks in the flesh kind of playing actually in a band, not on Top of the Pops, not on like Ready to Go or whatever. So that was in itself. And that was quite a bit of a kind of eye awakener, because these are just kind of like guys, Graham Chalk lived at the end of my street. That was the first time I kind of like, whoa, you can actually kind of like do this yourself. You can actually form a band and kind of form a punk band yourself. So that was a wee bit of an awakening. And then me and my mate John Tortolano, who I went to school with, who's John Tortolano. Aye, there was also the Bocellis who run the Allen Water fish and chip shop. They were my neighbours on the other. I had James A. the Fakes and Dave, who was a drummer in this kind of like weird Beefheart-esque kind of freak out hippie band called Shoe Peru, or Chow Pa. It's kind of like written. So they were in the house on one side, and on the other side there was the Bocellis, Adrian and Neil Bocelli. And like everybody, you know, I was too young to get into it in 77, 76, 77, but in 78, everybody kind of got into punk then.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, the whole idea, that's another thing. It's like the whole idea that punk was kind of like 76, 77, you know, it finished as soon as the Clash signed to EMI. Pish. I reckon basically just because of, you know, the way that things are obviously very, very London-centric, and then, you know, sort of come out a bit. It was probably really 78 that you could say that punk really exploded in Britain, or certainly in the provincial towns, certainly in, you know, like central Scotland.
Yeah.
But the Bocellis on one side, we just kind of muck about. We tape songs off the radio, like Sham 69 and the Pistols and all that. And then we had like acoustic guitars, and like Adrian had like ice cream tubs for drums, and I'd like sing. And we literally just have these, we had a shared back garden. All the families had like 5 houses, we had like a shared back garden, like a green. And we just kind of like mime to these songs being played in a ghetto blast and thrash away in the guitars and batter the drums and stuff. And all like local kids would just like sit on the wall and kind of watch and clap. Fucking mental, fucking brilliant. Have you seen the photos I've got of that? I've got a couple of photos of us as well. Not in the garden, unfortunately, but I've got a couple of photos. And then there was a Stirling Punk Festival, which I think was kind of like, it was really bleak weather. So I think it was maybe kind of like autumn 78 or maybe start of 79. I'll check, easy enough to check.
Yeah.
But I was at Path Foot, and that was the Fakes, Vertical Smiles, the Deltas, the Monos, another band, what are they called? Basically everybody who was anything in the central region, you know, punk bands, and plus the Cuban Heels, I think they played as well, who were from Greenock. Yeah. And if you've ever seen that film, Peter McDougall film, Just a Boys Game, that's actually the band you see at the beginning, if you've seen that. And then they're kind of hairy, it's like Young Teeny Bass. That's during the Cuban Heels set when they're playing a couple of tones painted black. So me and John Tortolano went to that, and that was fucking brilliant. And then the first big gig I ever went to was Sham 69 at Glasgow Apollo. The Valve support. It was like Sham 69's last stand it was billed as. And Sex Pistols had split up. And total surprise to me anyway, I'd never like seen any mere sounds or anything at the time, so I didn't know this was going to happen. And then Steve Jones and Paul Cook joined them on stage. The Sex Pistols had just split up of their American tour, and they do an encore of like Pretty Vacant, you know, God Save the Queen, all the sort of Pistols classics. And I'd have been 8 or 9 at the time. So you can imagine that was fucking mental. It was just like, oh my God. So that's kind of like my first, that wasn't exactly chronological, but that was kind of like my first experiences and exposure to punk, as it were.
Yeah. And when punk kind of got into like the 1980s, and it got a bit heavier and, you know, obviously a bit more kind of intense. Yeah. Did you see sort of a change in the bands in Scotland at the time when that sort of happened?
Well, interesting question. My first exposure to what later became known as like the anarcho-punk scene, which is what I was really kind of involved in myself, came through basically just picking up a few fanzines in the other record shop. There was one Saturday, also Crass played. I mean, as soon as Feeding the 5,000 came out, like everybody got into that. Everybody seemed to have a copy of Feeding the 5,000 almost kind of like overnight. And then I think very early 1980, or maybe it was late 79, they played at the Albert Hall,
Yeah.
So Crass played there with Poison Girls, and I think Seaman Stockton, who was the kind of poet they had before Andy T and Annie Anxiety. Yeah. And so we all went on to that, and that was really amazing. And the most striking thing about that was, I mean, I think I'd been to see like Jesus Christ Superstar, because I was a primary school then, so we'd been to see Jesus Christ Superstar with like a primary school trip, and my uncle had taken me and a mate to see Giant Haystacks and Big Daddy, like the kind of Saturday afternoon wrestling. So literally, you know, you're at those things 1 month, which are obviously like real kids things, And the next, 2 months later, you're seeing Crass there.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of an eye-opener. And also more so the fact that, I mean, I'd only been, actually, I've probably been to a few gigs there, because there used to be loads of good gigs up Path Foot. Like, I remember seeing Susie and the Banshees and the Join Hands tour.
Yeah.
See, there was always, can't remember, Gang of Four, the Skids, Perubu, Delta 5, loads of gigs. But the Crass gig was noticeable in that, you know, when you went in there, then they came into the audience and, you know, you could speak to them and they were giving away handbills and they had handfuls of badges and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then, you know, for the next weeks, everybody you'd see would be wearing, you know, Crass badges. So I got these fanzines. Round about that time, I got a copy of Toxic Graffiti. You might have seen the issue with the Crass flexi disc. That's a famous one. But the one before then was like even kind of crazier. And they had like this band, the Heretics and Flux of Pink Indians, or when they were known as the Epileptics. Maybe Poison Girls, a couple of other bands. Kill Your Pet Puppy fanzine, which has obviously gone on to be very kind of famous. And also the Bullshit Detector came out on Crass Records, which was like a compilation album they put out. So originally there wasn't really any sort of anarcho-punk bands in Stirling per se. There was a band called Spiked Copy who are kind of in that territory. But there weren't really any great kind of anarcho-punk scene per se. But just coming into contact with that and, you know, getting into the Crass thing and writing to other fanzine publishers and writing to other bands at your BBC, such as The Alternative, who went on to release a record on Crass Records, In Nomine Patri EP, Antichrist EP. They had a track in the first Bullshit Detector, which I think came out in 1980. So you wrote off to them, you get a demo tape back, etc., etc. And it was then that I started thinking about doing a fanzine. And the first fanzine I did was 1981. And obviously doing with the fanzine scene, that immediately brings you into contact with a whole kind of worldwide, you know, network of people doing fanzines, people in bands and things like that. At the time, I was in a band called Toxic Noise, which was with a couple of mates from all the guys were from St Ninians outside Stirling. There's 3 guys from St Ninians who I just knew from being kind of punks around about Stirling. But it was more like a muckabout band, you know. We just play like UK Subs Warhead. And I think that's pretty much it. I can't think we ever like played anything other than UK Subs Warhead. But then one Saturday afternoon, I came in, I met Ramsey, who was, at the time, he had Poison Girls on the back of his jacket. And I think that's how we got chatting. And obviously knew he was kind of like into anarcho-punk. I think we talked about Crash and stuff like that. And kept in touch. He was in a band then called Carnival of Death, which was basically just him and Cheesy, Stephen Brown, guitarist, went on all the way through Political Asylum, and another guy called Martin. And they didn't have a drummer. So they asked, so I'd recently just got a drum kit, and they asked me if I wanted to drum for them. And I said aye. It went on for a few practices. Shortly after that, we changed our name to Distraught and played our first gig in, I think it was like, I've actually got a ticket for it as well, March or April 1982 at the Braco Town Hall. With the other band playing was a band called Vengeance, who was mates of mine from school. And their bass player's a guy, Mickey McGlashan, now goes by the name of Rich McGlashan. He's still very active in the punk scene. He has like a wee, he has a farm
in DC, and
he's a totally mint guy. Rich is an amazing. So him as well, and everything just kind of like snowballed from there, really. So and you know the politics were absolutely integral to that scene. You know, I mean, without the politics, it was kind of nothing. You know, so everything developed from there, and through these bands, you know, you end up making links with other bands. You know, playing gigs with them. Like there was some band who were on the Bullshit Detector 2, Deformed, and we were writing to them, and we got them to play Stirling, and they played the St Ninians, the Mayfield Centre in St Ninians, which I think was our third gig, Political Asylum's third gig, which was the only gig I played with them after we'd recorded that Fresh Hate demo tape.
And did you find within sort of maybe the kind of like central scene round about Stirling and stuff that there was a lot of that division? For example, you know, a lot of like the sort of like crass punks hated the exploited punks and, you know, stuff like that. Was there a lot of division about that?
Not so much. What I'd say is basically the more kind of provincial you got and the smaller, I mean, Stirling was a town then, you know, it's now got like city states, but it was a town then. as was, you know, Creef, as well, you know, Dunblane and all these places around by that. I think because the scenes were actually relatively small, you didn't really get that sort of divisive tribalist aspect. You know, everybody was just kind of like punks in the same way as you generally hang about with like skinheads as well.
Yeah.
You know, I think maybe in the cities you'd have got that, but.
And you mentioned the Kill Your Pet Puppy.
One thing I do remember is like when Adam and the Ants. Because Adam and the Ants were kind of originally quite a kind of like underground punk band, and then when they got famous, there was all like, you know, there was folk you'd see with like Adam and the Ants kind of makeup and like the sort of jackets and stuff, and they like got a healthy slagging after Adam and the Ants started Kings of the Wild Frontier and appearing on Top of the Pops and stuff.
Cool. You mentioned the Kill Your Pet Puppy fanzine, and I want to talk to you about because it's now on the internet, and on there I'd found it was like a Stirling Punk compilation. How did that come about? The creation of that compilation?
Well, I just came through the back of my fanzine. I also released, the first thing I put out was a recording of the Fakes. It's called the Fakes Live in Room 7, which is just a rehearsal room in Airdrie Castle, I think.
Yeah.
And I put that out. That was basically on the back of the second issue of my fanzine, which I'll send you a copy of that actually, because I found like a big kind of stash of them. So on the back of that, I released that tape. And then because I was actually getting sent so many tapes by bands from roundabout, I basically just put together a compilation tape of local bands. Most of the bands, I mean, you know, there's bands from Menstrie to Stenhousemuir.
Yeah.
You know, so it's quite, geographically, it's quite diverse. Certainly taking a great deal of license for the concept of Central Scotland. But so they were all mostly kind of round about the Stirling area, mates bands, etc. Folk I knew from just kind of hanging about in town. And also there was a couple of live tracks from Screaming Babies and Belfast and Horrors, who were both Edinburgh bands. Singer in Belfast and Horrors was Lenny, who went on to be the Thanes, who were quite a big kind of like psychedelic act. And that gig was actually recorded at the first ever Exploited gig, Wester Hailes Community Centre.
All right.
The Fakes also played that. Fakes were headlining that, I think.
Speaking of the Fakes, as I know, you know Johnny, and you've had a bit of a history with the Fakes. What was sort of like the first time you'd maybe like met Johnny or that, and what was the kind of like first time you'd ever started hanging around with them and seeing them?
Well, the first thing is you used to see graffiti all about town with like the Fakes Are No Real, and everybody had these brilliant badges with the Fakes Are No Real. And then I can't remember. It's like my mum used to know Mary, who was guitarist in the Fakes. Yeah. My mum always used to chat away to her, and I think it was her who first said, "Oh, you know, Jamesy's like they're like lives next door." And I was like, "What the fuck?" Because I hadn't seen them then, or maybe I had seen them. I had seen them. I think I'd seen them at the Stirling Punk Festival. But so I mean, I was obviously too young to be kind of hanging about with them, but I did like a sort of posthumous interview with them, which would have been probably about a year and a half after production EP had come out, and obviously in that time they'd split up. Oh, and Jamesy and Johnny had formed a new band called New Youth. Yeah. Who were a much more kind of like post-punk sound, but they were really, really excellent, really, really good band. And I went along to one of their rehearsals and taped the rehearsal. I've got a fantastic tape of that, and also took some photos and did a proper interview. That's probably the first proper sit-down interview I'd ever done with a band as well, come to think of it.
What did you think of their, like, at the time with the Fakes, what did you think of their sound? Because when you listen back to that production EP, you know, it is a punk record, but there's other elements of it that are very different.
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I mean, at the time, their big track I remember was Tony Blackburn. That's a track that I remember like everybody was like going mental to at that Stirling Punk Festival, and that was like their kind of like anthem. And you know, when I first heard Production, but then again, Production, I can't remember if Production came out round about the same time as Death Disco, Public Image. You know, because it'd be interesting. I should actually easy enough to find out which came out before. But I remember, and obviously the Susie and the Banshees Join Hands album. So round about, it almost seemed like, you know, within a fairly specific time frame, you know, basically like a few months, suddenly there was these records which were coming out, which were, you know, inverted commas punk bands as we understood it, but the sound was very, very different to what you know, because by that time you'd have like UK subs doing Stranglehold and Top of the Pops and Jellycup Start, Simon Upstart. So it did seem like a sort of conscious departure from that trad punk sound. into areas which were, a lot more experimental, which at the time, being like a kind of like 10, 11-year-old punk, you just wanted stuff to go about it. So it's not like you really kind of like fully understood it. But in retrospect, I mean, production's an absolutely phenomenal EP. I always absolutely adore the fact that when you think of like, bands in other cities, you think of like, maybe like Joseph K or something like that, kind of like chipper pop, or like Edinburgh. You think of like, Orange Juice or like Postcard Records for Glasgow or something. And all there is for Stirling is like the production EP. And it's like so fucking grim, but so brilliant. I love that.
After the Fakes had split, and obviously, there was all these other kind of smaller bands and Political Asylum and stuff like that. Right. Did you find that as the sort of kind of as the early 80s kind of came on and the kind of sort of UK sub sound and the kind of oi kind of, dischargey kind of sound came in, that a lot of those bands maybe kind of changed or folded up because of the kind of difference in the music?
Well, it's quite, I mean, have you heard that compilation tape I did?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, apart from Ourselves, Distraught, which was like Political Asylum, those tracks are recorded at that Breako gig. They're live tracks. There was another band called Polax, whose guitarist lived in Bridge of Allen. They're the only bands, actually, because I listened to it a wee while ago, they're the only bands on it you'd actually identify with having what sounded anything like a kind of 1980s punk sound, which obviously later on became known as the kind of UK 82 sound, where you can hear like the influence of, say, Discharge, and obviously the most influential kind of punk band like Since the Pistols, really, in terms sonically anyway. And you listen to bands like The Ideas. Who else is on it? There's The Ideas. Most of the bands have what you'd now identify as a post-punk sound.
Yeah.
I don't know. Have you also heard that compilation tape that Billy McCord put out, the Ankle File?
Yeah, I've heard that.
I mean, that's very much a kind of post-punk sound, with I mean, you've got bands like Curious Rain, who were regarded almost as like futurists at the time. They had like synth and, which in retrospect, it's kind of obviously they're going for quite, and those French girls as well, who supported the Skids of Stirling Uni. Those bands were kind of regarded almost like as futurists because they sort of came out round about the same time as Visage and Spandau Ballet and stuff. So that's kind of like where they are. Well, they were kind of more associated with, in the receivers' perception anyway.
So from round about the time that
sorry to get back to your question, I wasn't really aware of, I mean, at the time Political Asylum was going, at the time I was in Political Asylum, I wasn't aware of any other bands in the Stirling area who were really punk bands at all. I don't think there were any, because otherwise we'd have played with them. When we played that gig at Mayfield, we played that with a band called Four Walls Shaken, which was like a kind of psychobilly band, which Guy Greaves, again, was in.
Because that's what I was going to say. In my sort of like own research from sort of researching Stirling punk, I'd kind of noticed that after Political Asylum, the track kind of went dead.
Right.
So I was kind of wondering, kind of as the kind of 80s went on and got later and into the 90s and stuff, did you sort of see a decline maybe in sort of maybe like the central Scotland area or Scotland in general in terms of kind of a mass punk scene being about?
Well, one thing I'd never actually thought about until now is that in Stirling, I mean, what's obviously, imperative for the development and sort of longevity of any sort of punk scene is simply accessible venues. And all the venues in Stirling really would have been pubs, where all those, sort of place where New Youth played, where all those bands like, for instance, Billy's Ankle File compilation would have played. These would all have been pubs. Like you probably heard of, venues like, the Ganachie, well, there was obviously the Ganachie, there was Path Foot, which was like larger gigs. There was Lake Cleek up the top of the town. There was a few venues. There was, what was it called? Ravi's Bar, that place just kind of near Cornton Crescent. There was quite a lot of venues where you'd get gigs, but these would tend, these were like kind of proper like drinking pubs. And there's no way under that age you'd be able to have a gig there. That's why the two Political Asylum gigs were respectively in a youth centre and a town hall. And the second Political Asylum was at Ramsey's, was at Stirling High. So, without places for bands to play, you're never really going to get a scene. But you know, going wider, it's quite funny actually, because I remember I'd written a letter to Deke of Oi Polloi. It was around about the time Oi Polloi was started, right? 81 or something. And I wrote Deke a letter, and my mum was like, "Oh, the Allens." And it turned out that basically my parents were friends with Deke's parents, going back, you know, like decades. And also Deke and his brother Donnie had like visited our house. So I'd actually first met Deke when I was about 4 or something. They came through to, I was like, "Oh, right, that tall laddie with kind of red hair." And we were kind of like family friends. So obviously, Oi Polloi were getting started. I went through, and this is when they used to rehearse in, his name, Jason, the guy Jason's attic. But their rehearsals were always kind of like Saturday afternoons, and they were just more like kind of like wee gigs, like wee parties. Like Oi Polloi would always play, maybe a couple of other bands would also play the same rehearsal space, and everybody would just sit around drinking bottles of cider and stuff. And so that was like early Oi Polloi gigs. And their first few gigs were at schools. I think I was definitely some of their very, very first gigs, which again would have been in, you know, youth centres, church halls, stuff like that. And, you know, Deke certainly did a lot for, well, obviously he was like integral to the development of kind of Edinburgh anarcho-punk scene, stroke DIY scene.
Yeah.
You know, there was a few other folk who were kind of involved. Like he used to do a fanzine called Skinhead Havoc, which was just a kind of like piss take type zine. But it was a guy, John Green, who very sadly died. He used to do compilation tapes, and he used to also send in these like ridiculous made up charts to sounds. Like you'd get the Herbert chart and the Oi chart and stuff like that, and the real punk chart, which were always like ascribed to places like, you know, like the punk, the real punk chart would be like the Edinburgh Anarchy Centre, which of course didn't exist.
Yeah.
And the Herbert chart would be like, you know, the Herbert HQ, such and such. And fantastic stuff. Some of these are online. Do you remember like the subcultures page on Facebook?
Yeah.
Aye. Some of those, you know, if you ever want any of these kind of like source materials, just put up a wee thing, and folk will definitely post them.
The next question I want to talk about is sort of because from what I've experienced, sort of in Stirling, you know, hanging around and, you know, liking punk music and stuff like that, is for a long time, you know, I had a lot of people coming up to me, you know, saying you're the only young one and stuff like that. And then round about 2018, 2019, when I got to know Johnny, the Fakes had reformed.
Yes.
So what was that like, sort of you seeing them reform with a new kind of line?
I just wish I'd been able to make it up to the gig. I was in Japan at the time, because I spent a lot of time in Japan. I was just gutted I couldn't make it up there. It just looked fantastic. And again, when you hear of bands reforming, it's always kind of like, it's like, you know, are they going to be able to cut it? You know, are they going to do like the kind of, you know, the perennial, you know, this is like one of our new tracks, and it's basically, it's utter mints, and everybody kind of goes to the bar, and it's, you know, them trying to kind of sound, like update their sound with some perception of, you know, what is like the current sound. And it's like the last band I was in, part one, we played Rebellion and kind of did a lot of the bands that you thought were like absolutely fantastic. You know, when you're a kid, you see them now, and I always call them sort of like beer bellies and bondage trouser bands, because they're invariably like these kind of guys who you just know have like, you know, that it's like they've been booked to play Rebellion, they've just gone out and like bought a leather jacket and a pair of bondage trousers, and they just look fucking terrible, and their songs are just like abysmal, and the kind of lyrical are always just fairly cringeworthy. So there's a lot of them. But I think the fact is, because the Fakes weren't like a kind of a verified political band. So again, you know, the Fakes were just kind of like themselves. I mean, there wasn't really any band like the Fakes. You know, they were very much a kind of like 77 type band. It lasted years later. So they didn't really have those, how do you describe it? They didn't really have those tropes which tend to date anything which folk have tried to drag 35 years plus into, you know, contemporary times. So I thought, from the videos, I thought they were fantastic, and it was the version of production was just mind blowing. I was just watching that just the other day. It's just like, fucking hell, it's so good. It just had actually more kind of like atonal and intense than, you know, even the single version, which obviously is quite an achievement.
Yeah.
He's got one of those brilliant voices as well.
Yeah.
You know, nobody ever like had a voice. Nobody's ever like delivered a song like production or anything. You know,
Yeah.
there was no explicit tracks ever sounded like that.
No.
You know, there was nothing else I can really think of.
Yeah. I remember the first time I played that, I think it was for my aunt, put it on, and when Johnny started singing, she went, "Is that you?"
Yeah.
Because it's one of those kind of accents that you don't necessarily hear on a record a lot.
Also, another thing about that EP is the entire kind of presentation of it as well. It's just like, you know, that cover, which I think is from Grangemouth, maybe. I remember the girl who actually took the cover is on Facebook, and she posted up on the Facebook page where it was from. But so I think that's basically from there, and just the, you know, the photo booth photos in the back, and just like the kind of like letraset text. It's just so perfect. The whole presentation of it is just so kind of minimal and samizdat, and you know what we now perceive as DIY, which just goes so well with the actual music.
And of course, the Fakes sadly split in '79 from the death of Brian. What was his death felt in the community?
Yeah, no, I remember it was in the local papers and everything. Definitely. It was like, you know, it was the one thing that all the kind of, because obviously, you know, in a place as small as, you know, Stirling and Bridge of Allen, it's like the Fakes were kind of like our band. And I only ever got to see them once. Me and my mates used to like cycle up to where they were playing in other gigs. And we just like stand, because we couldn't get in, and we just stand about outside, just kind of like listening to it, you know, and peering through the windows, you know, because we were like, you know, these were all licensed places. There's no way we could actually get into the gigs. But we just like kind of stand outside, and like that was like really exciting to do even then. And then I remember, you know, like speaking to James A, and, you know, I remember my mum speaking to Mary, and, you know, it was definitely kind of definitely felt within the Stirling punk scene.
Yeah.
I mean, tragic for anybody at that age, you know, irrespective of anything. Of course, you know, so I'm sure that kind of resonated out with the punk scene, you know, I'm sure. Because again, you see, another thing with a place like Stirling is when you're like in a band, it's not, you know, although I say Distraught, Political Asylum, although we were like, you know, punk bands very much, it's like all your mates will come along to your gigs, all your mates will buy the tape. You know, if you were actually to do a kind of breakdown of, you know, the subcultural demographic of the folk who attended that first Distraught gig at Braco, it's like basically half my school went along, and most of them were into like, you know, guys, you know, there was that kind of like late 70s, early 80s thing. All guys would have like denim jackets with, you know, a Motorhead sewn or a White Snake pack. You know, it was all, so most of them were just kind of like, you know, it's because again, that was the thing I always say to folk, like in late 70s, early 80s, you were either into music or you were into football. So like pretty much everyone into music would have come along to the gig.
Yeah, and then now, you know, in the world and the sort of the social things that are going on, do you think that there could ever sort of be maybe like young people sort of inspired to kind of maybe start a punk scene in Stirling?
Well, you can only hope so. Because basically, as a voice of opposition to all the kind of like shite that's fucking going on, especially now when things are like as worse than they've ever been, you know, it's one of these things which can only like give you faith in kind of humanity and faith in kind of like, you know, the youth of today, to use a cliche. But you know, and the thing that really fucking depresses me to fuck. I mean, I used to be, you know, all these kind of like Facebook punk pages and stuff, and most of them I've just ended up leaving because of all like Tory shite and, you know, Tory punks. I mean, where the fuck's that? Even on the Crass page, like with like, you know, just, I mean, to me that's just like unbelievable. But what I'd personally say possibly is like, you know, to me, and you know, like the more you get on, it's like punk's definitely like a kind of attitude, and I think an attitude stays with you in life. And what I often think now is, you know, if you think about it, there's nothing more kind of like punk and more DIY than like these kind of like young grime kids who basically just be making like grime and like rap tracks on like software, like their PlayStations and stuff. In my last flat, I was speaking to these kids, and they were just out recording vocals outside their house, really young wee black kids. And I was just kind of chatting away with them for a while, and I was going, "Oh, what's that stuff?" And they were just saying about how they just record these tracks on, I'm sure it was PlayStation or something. There's some sort of sound card, or I don't know anything about technology. And they were just kind of like laying down tracks outside because they wanted to get like the, what's it called, diagenetic sound of you know, cars and everything. And you know, these things, they can then, for zero money and zero musical expertise, there's that whole thing, there's that whole thing in Sideburns fanzine which is wrongly attributed to Stiff and Glue. Here's a chord, here's another chord, now go and form a band.
Yeah.
Now for kids, they be able to play a chord, let alone even know what a chord is. It's just a matter of getting kind of, just sampling sounds, kind of like rapping over the top of that. They can stick that up in YouTube and it can become viral. And that is something which can actually end up being like a massive track,
Yeah.
And, a lot of those songs have social messages every bit as, anti-system and every bit as, sort of subversive. It's especially if it's coming from black kids in Britain at the moment, given that, the racism that's now kind of inherent in like culture. So that stuff's, that stuff I'd say to a very great extent is probably, the punk of today. And if you're like a young kid, that's probably the stuff you'd get into, especially in Europe, you maybe not so much Britain, because I don't think Britain's really got that kind of infrastructure of, a very base thing to simply being squats. Now you don't get squatting in Britain anymore. And, since the early 80s, for the past 35 odd years, the squat scene's been fairly integral to any kind of underground punk scene. And without that infrastructure, it's not really got the things, like it'd be quite hard to put on a DIY punk gig, charging like £5 for a load of bands, etc., but having to have it in inverted commas commercial venue where you're going to have security, it's licensed, etc.
Yeah.
So that, which is also good. Why you've got like you still got like centres going on, DIY centres and things like that, because that maintains that kind of lifeblood for the whole scene.
Well, Chris, thank you. This has been absolutely brilliant.
Chris's interview was very informative and taught me a lot about the Stirling punk scene. But now, we move to the next interview. The next interview is with a guy I know by the name of Derek. He's in 2 bands at the moment, Rare Breed, who are an oi band, and his punk band with his wife, the Dreggs. In our interview, we spoke about the Edinburgh punk scene, the Fife punk scene, and what it was like being a skinhead in Scotland.
So how are we all doing, Derek?
We're all fine, Paul. We're all good.
And so I suppose the first question would be, how did you get into the punk scene / the Scottish punk scene?
Come back. Well, I started 1979. I would have been 6-year-old.
Okay.
Madness, Specials, The Beat, and I'm sure it was Bad Manners were on Top of the Pops on the one episode, and that was me. I was hooked with the ska stuff and that. And then it wasn't until I was about 17, so that would have been 1989. I got into punk and oi.
Okay.
Because my teenage years were, I listened to everything from Iron Maiden to the Beatles to the Stones and whatever, you know what I mean? But it wasn't until I was 17 that I got given a video called UKDK.
All right, aye.
The Exploited, the Business Nut on it, and I played that video tape to death, man. And that's what I think that's what really got me going with it, you know what I mean?
And what was sort of like maybe like the first kind of like oi punk band that you saw in Scotland?
First punk band I've seen. Maybe Fire Exit or 4:30. I couldn't tell you when, because my teenage years and my 20s are a bit of a blur.
Right.
You know what I mean? But I'd seen a lot of bands. A lot of ska bands as well, because I've seen Bad Manners 42 times.
Right.
I've seen Selector 30 times.
Okay.
I've seen Madness about, I don't know, 15 times, you know what I mean? So, aye.
And did you find back in the day, was the Fife scene sort of pretty wealthy with punk, or was it only in certain areas?
I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you about the Fife scene, but it was more the Edinburgh and Glasgow scene, you know what I mean? Because in Edinburgh, who this? Oh, Sad Society. I've seen them umpteen times. And I used to hang about with all the punks, because all the punks and that used to go to the Mound in Edinburgh. Because I moved away from Glasgow and ended up in Edinburgh. And we all used to sit and get bevied at the Mound or go down into the gardens and whatever. And then there was always a punk's picnic and stuff like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. What was maybe inspired by punk? What was the first notion that you had in order to maybe like start a band or create a piece of music?
I wasn't told later to about this. Right, so you heard the Bomb Scare?
Yeah.
The ska band, right? I was their first drummer.
All right.
Right. Back when it started, it was me, Big Andy, who sings with the Pandas now. Miggy, he DJs and that now. Chicken, who's in, he's been in the Harringtons, Bomb Scare. He's been in about 40 different bands, you know what I mean? So that was about 24 years ago. So that was about the first time I got playing with a band.
Yeah.
Back then. And then there was a big gap to about maybe 14, 15 years ago.
Right.
And then we started an oi band in Edinburgh. And then when I met my wife, we started the Dreggs. And now I've got another band, Rare Breed, you know what I mean? So it's always been about. And the funny thing is, I tried to write songs about 7 years ago, right? 8 years ago, maybe even longer. And I thought they were shit. But I'm actually using them now, you know what I mean? Because I've looked at them again and tweaked them and that. So the songwriting's mainly been in the last 2 years, you know what I mean?
Yeah. When the sort of kind of late 90s came in and the kind of early 2000s, did you notice sort of a difference in the sort of wider punk scene in Scotland, that there wasn't as much?
It was still there, right? But it died down a lot, you know what I mean? There wasn't as many gigs, and you weren't seeing as many people walking about the town or anything like that. Because at one point you could walk along the street and you bump into somebody you know who was a punk or whatever. But the 2000s, it sort of died down a bit.
Yeah.
Except the hardcore ones.
Aye. And do you think that those sort of great 90s bands like Machine Gun Etiquette and the Grunts and Cathedra and stuff, do you think they maybe kind of finished the way that they did because of the scene sort of ending, or not ending, but sort of getting as thin as it did? Or
I think it was a mixture. It sort of dying down, families, people settling down and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Aye. But saying that, Cathedra got back, what would have been about 3 years ago now, and they played at Rebellion 3 years ago. Sure, it was 3 years ago. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But with the Grunts and them, I think it was, they got jobs, they grew up, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They grew up, they had wains and whatever, so all that stopped, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And in terms of Edinburgh, Cramond Island tended to be a big thing in the scene. What was that like, sort of the first year it happened, and were you sort of there in the early stages?
I've only made it to Cramond twice. And all I can remember, the first one is waking up and the tide was in and I couldn't get off the island because I was that drunk. I was drunk before I even got there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the second time, oh God. That was... What I liked about it was about Cramond. It just wasn't all the locals, punks and that I went. They came from all the place. And I've met, the last time I was at it, I met punks from Mexico,
Yeah.
America, Germany, and that, who have just came out for it. So that tells you something about it, you know what I mean? If
Yeah.
people are willing to travel out to have a gig in an island in the middle of the Forth, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it can twist in the rain, that, and they're no bothered, you know what I mean?
Plus, when I was there, I'd kind of noticed that we would be like on the hills and on the bunkers, and we would meet random folk that didn't know what was happening.
Aye. And it's been going there for years, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Aye. The random tourist out walking their dog going, what's happening here? You know what I mean?
Those punk picnics that happened sort of in the 80s in Edinburgh, do they sort of compare differently now to sort of the punks picnics that happen now, or are they slightly different?
They were a lot busier back in the early 90s and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? You could get an easy 200-300 people at it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then again, they come through all over the place for it.
And did you find that back then there was a lot of maybe hassle from people like the police and other elements because of
There's always hassle with the police.
Yeah.
There was always hassle with the police. And there was always hassle at it. You know what I mean? Because I went down to it one year and ended up fighting.
All right.
And I was only there 5 minutes. That's just because they go, oh, look, there's a skinhead. He's a Nazi, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Didn't get a chance to defend myself or anything. So I ended up having to fight against about 5 or 6 Spanish punks, you know what I mean?
And did you find that a lot back in the day, sort of being a skinhead as being typecast as...
Oh, aye. All the time. Still get that nowadays, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've been in pubs and I've had arguments with people going, skinheads are not all skinheads are Nazis, this is how it started, blah, blah, blah. But I've got that idea of a skinhead being a bloody bonehead in their head, you know what I mean? Which is not true. A percentage of them that are boneheads, but I have nothing to do with them.
Do you think that sort of public image of skinheads being portrayed as boneheads could ever be changed?
No, it doesn't. You could try, you know what I mean, but I don't know how much good it would do, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there's that conception people have got of skinheads, and then what the media think is skinheads, not in the papers, it doesn't help.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And back then, because you were saying about how you ended up fighting with guys at the punks picnic, obviously back then, you know, there was kind of divisions going on in the punk scene anyway, of the kind of punks fighting skinheads and the kind of anarcho scene being against the oi scene. Did you kind of feel that was very much like that in Scotland?
It was, especially in Edinburgh, you know what I mean? But it was weird. I go on fine with Edinburgh punks, and I used to drink with them and whatever. And I was like in the middle of the skinhead camp and the punk camp, you know what I mean? But some of the skinheads I knew were right wing, some weren't, some were Trojan, or they've all got labels, you know what I mean? And I've not got a like. I'm just a skinhead, and I'm no racist. I love ska, I love punk, I love all that. That's me. You know what I mean? But you've got all these people who will say they're grey zone or whatever. You know what I mean? I just can't be doing with that push. You know what I mean?
No.
Everybody should just get on with each other.
Yeah.
Because the scene would be so much better. You know what I mean? If it wasn't this snobbery. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And so, sort of coming back to what I'd asked before, you're obviously in Fife now. So, what was your first kind of, maybe sort of, kind of your first time hearing about sort of maybe bands going on in Fife, or your first kind of time down there and seeing stuff?
Right, so the first punk band I seen was Patrol at the Fun Pub in Leaving. Aye, that was a good night, that was.
Was that when they reformed?
Aye, and then when I played in this band, we supported English Dogs at the Wellesley, One Way System at the Wellesley, I seen the UK subs at Wesley, and then it would have been 10 years ago, you had the first Fife Punk Fest at the Windsor, you know what I mean? I think pre-lockdown and all that crap, it was getting better, there was gigs happening, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But now we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah.
But we have got a pub in Leaving, in Mephill, in fact, called the Purple Cat. The guy that owns it is a punk, and he puts bands on all the time. But a lot of people kind of get to it because where it is, you know what I mean? But it's a good wee pub for a gig.
As you know, obviously, as you've said, you've been in bands and you've written your own stuff. In terms of subject matter for songs, do you think it's important to have a message? Because I know a lot of boy bands will have a message in their music, but a lot of them will kind of maybe talk about fighting or drinking. So do you think it's important to kind of have a message while still talk about those things?
Aye, but I wouldn't glorify, like, in Rare Breed, we don't glorify fighting and stuff like that and whatever. We've got songs about when we were away or about somebody screwing hussies or I'm trying to think what else, about independence for Scotland. That's what we believe in, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's the first song on my CD. It's always the first song we play, and we'll always play that until we take it independence, you know what I mean?
And, on your EP, you have a cover of Work Together by The Oppressed. I was just wondering how much of an influence on you and the sort of bands that you've been in have The Oppressed been?
The Oppressed. Well, I think for me personally, I wouldn't say the band. Maybe more for me and McGill the singer. Same Mark as well, you know what I mean, the drummer. We've listened to The Oppressed since 84, 85 maybe. And I suppose they have, but then again, they're an anti-fascist oi band, you know what I mean? And they sing a lot about violence and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that's their thing, but I wouldn't say it's influenced me that way when I'm writing about violence or anything like that. But maybe the sound, just because it's raw and it's nothing fancy, it's just straight to the point, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
I hate it when they get overindulgent with 20-minute lead guitar bits and crap like that, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So in terms of sort of how the scene is now, obviously with myself, but with sort of other sort of younger people coming in, do you think that it's slowly on the rise again, or do you think it's still got a bit?
I've noticed it more in Glasgow. Like, there's more youngins going to gigs and stuff like that, and that's great to see. You know what I mean? Even before the first time I met you at the audio, I'd still seen all the youngins hanging about McDonald's and all that. And all these wee young guys jumping about dressed as skinheads and punks. I'm like, do they know what it's about?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So in Glasgow, I've seen it more there. But the thing is, with a lot of youngins, they'll get into it for maybe 2, 3, 4 years and then they'll fade away from it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I've seen that a lot over the years. And even at the Rebellion, I've seen a lot more young punks and skins and hermits, whatever you want to call them. So I think if people go to gigs and support the bands, the scene would be really good, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's the problem. You get these people who just go and see the big bands.
Aye.
Like Stranglers and GBH, whatever. When a big band comes to go and see it, but they need to support the scene, and the youngins will do that if they stick at it, you know what I mean?
Exactly. You spoke of Rebellion there, and kind of one of the points that I know that from sort of friends in Rebellion, that a lot of kind of younger punks tend to just sit outside and drink for the entire weekend. Do you see that as a sort of like a wasted sort of weekend?
No,
or?
They're just doing what we done 20 years ago. That's the way I look at it, you know what I mean? They'll go and see local bands and support the local scene and all that and everything and that, but they're just doing what we done, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That about and got pushed and whatever, that was... And a lot of them going to at Rebellion, you've got all these other wee gigs going on at the Waterloo and the Tash and stuff like that. You go to their gigs as well, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Free, because they're getting in there for free. Half of them have been anywhere to stay when they're doing there, you know what I mean? They're all sleeping on the beach. That's the type of things we used to do, you know what I mean? So it's just, I think it's, you could say it's a rite of passage.
Yeah. Because sort of what I've noticed from the punk scene now is that, you know, whether you're punk or skinhead or psychobilly, whatever, in terms of sort of your go-to, was it like that back in the day? You know, did like a lot of kind of punks go to psychobilly gigs and did a lot of skinheads kind of go to, you know, whatever?
Personally, for me, I'd go to any gig, you know what I mean? I used to go to ska gigs, I used to go to oi gigs, I used to go to punk gigs. But then you'd have punks going, I'm not going to that gig, you're a oi band, blah, 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 but back in the 90s and stuff like that, I didn't really know much about psychobilly or anything like that, you know what I mean? And I don't think there was as many gigs back then than there is now, because there seems to be a lot more, you know what I mean? And there's another thing you'll find there's a lot of guys on the scene who were in the scene back in the late 70s and 80s, and then they went and got married and got jobs and became normal for a while, and now they're getting back into the scene, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a second youth for them.
Yeah.
You see a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. In terms of sort of right-wing people sort of entering the scene, particularly maybe in Glasgow, but in other areas, was it as prevalent as it was back then as it is now, or was it?
No, back in the 80s, 84 onwards, 82 onwards, there was I know for a fact in Edinburgh, you had all these skinhead gangs from like Wester Hales and the city centre and Nidri and all that, and a lot of them were right wing. Aye. I think nowadays there's a lot less right wingers go to gigs and stuff like that. But if they're going to it and they'll keep their mouth shut and there's only a small few of them that will broadcast what their beliefs are and stuff like that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We played a gig in Fife, it would have been 3 years ago, and a guy turned up in a Screwdriver t-shirt.
Yeah. And
Marlin marched him right out the fucking pub, man. You get out, get that fucking t-shirt. I've gone mental on him. The Screwdriver t-shirt on. Aye.
And so would you say that sort of nowadays, especially with sort of maybe the younger punks who feel that they sort of have a responsibility to sort of kind of get that out of their scene, do you think that's the best way to sort of handle it, or do you think there's a...
I think there's no room for that shit nowadays, Hamish, you know what I mean? So I think it's not just the youngins, I think it's everybody's who isn't right wing should be chasing the fuckers out, you know what I mean?
Aye.
I've wrote a song called "I Ain't for Boneheads." There you go.
Yeah.
I've not finished it yet, but it's just about done.
Yeah. I guess I want to bring it back to Fife now. Obviously, you know, your wife was in the Newtown Grunts and stuff like that, who are my favourite Scottish punk band just in general. But what influence would you say that maybe the Grunts had, not just in Fife, but on the wider kind of punk scene in Scotland?
Oh, they had a big influence, I think, in a lot of bands, you know what I mean? Because they really got signed to Hellcat Records and stuff like that.
All right.
Just the manager that screwed it up, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Twice they really got signed, and they went and played in Germany and England and everything, you know what I mean? So they were a big influence. It's like, I've not met a person who knows the Newtown Grunts and says a bad word about them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not one. And their songs were good.
Yeah. And do you find that
because those bands like Cathedra, Machine Gun Etiquette, and the Newtown Grunts and stuff, they were so brilliant and so unique sounding that, you know, they're regarded as sort of, you know, some of the greatest bands that Scottish punks ever put out. Do you think that now there could ever be sort of bands that had that kind of sound?
I think there could be, you know what I mean? But would they want to do it? That's the only thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the thoughts just came to my head. The Tapa Lauriston in Edinburgh pub is no longer there, right? There was some mental gigs in there during the 90s. That was unbelievable. The Grunts used to play all the time, Machine Gun Etiquette, Sad Society, Oi Polloi, everything, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've seen loads of bands there at that, but I can remember about 5. Because it was always mental, you know what I mean? It was a sad day when that place got shut down.
I suppose, sort of bringing it back to ska, you know, and stuff like that, did you sort of see, sort of back in the day in Scotland at the time, that maybe not just with punks and skinheads, but ska was sort of a big influence on a lot of people anyway?
Oh, because it was, the vast majority of people were growing up to two-tone and whatever, you know what I mean? So, and then there's always been good ska bands in Scotland. Back in the 90s, you had Proy, Capone and the Bullets for Glasgow, and then they disbanded, but they're back together. And then you've had the 1 O'Clock Guns. No, they weren't. They were a covers band. What they call it, the Harringtons. That was another ska band for Edinburgh. Bomb Scare, Amphetamines for Glasgow. You know what I mean? There's always been a right good ska bands for Scotland.
Yeah.
So I think that's always been a big influence to people as well. Because you've got the Scarsouls, I think they're through your way, Stirling, I think. There's loads of good, there's always been good ska bands, you know what I mean? And even through the 90s and the 2000s, when like Bad Manners came to Edinburgh, or The Beat, or Selector, or even Laurel Aiken. I mean, seeing Laurel Aiken in the late 19s. Is that right? About 98, 97, 98, and he's like the godfather of ska and stuff, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's always been good stuff.
Yeah. And did you find that ska maybe educated a lot of people who would have maybe have possibly have been right wing?
Aye. Because I know guys who were right wing, who aren't the right wing anymore because they've grew up, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think a lot of that back then was just to fit in and peer pressure and whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They didn't really have a clue and didn't know anything about it, you know what I mean? They were just doing it because everybody else was doing it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I know guys now who are in ska bands.
Yeah.
That used to have right wing tendencies, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I've noticed through sort of how it is now for other sort of publications, like, for example, Mark Magee's You Call That Radio and stuff like that, he's been playing, you know, Redbeard and a few other ska bands. Have you kind of noticed that it might be more prevalent in Glasgow, but sort of that level of sort of media and scene have gotten interested in the ska scene in Scotland?
But I think that's got a lot to do with the bands as well. Because I know with Redbeard, because Rod for Redbeard was in the Grunts, singer, right? So, and we got out the Amphetamines, they're making videos, and for everything they bring out, they're making videos for it, and they're posting it, and they're getting contact with radio stations, and they were in the papers, the Dundee Courier the other week there, because they've redone a Grunt song. Was it Toe Pokes and Tragedies?
Yeah.
Right, it's an old Grunt song about when, because back then it was when Scotland were going to France for the Euros, so they've redone that again.
Yeah.
And made it a double spread in the papers, you know what I mean? So it's a lot to do with the bands. putting themselves out there.
Yeah.
And then because they're doing that, all these wee radio stations, internet radio stations and whatever, are picking up on that, and they've got shows now and whatever, you know what I mean? Which is good. It's good for the scene.
Yeah. What do you think is the future of the Scottish punk scene, whether it's in Glasgow, Edinburgh, or wherever?
See if it was the stroke tourists, it's going, or the infighting and people going, I'm not doing this gig for him, I'm not doing that gig for him, blah, 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 all that shit. See if we could get rid of all that.
Yeah.
I think the scene could be a lot better. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? But it still needs younger bands coming through. Dundee's really good for young bands in there. You've got the Overbites, you've got Dog Eared. There's loads of cracking wee bands coming through for Dundee. And even up in Schizophrenic for up north, another good punk band, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's needing younger ones to start bands like
Yeah.
yourself here. Hurry up.
I will. Have you also felt that, because for me, sort of being, you know, in the sort of scene with a lot of people my own age, I mean, I get along with everybody, but I have noticed that there's that thing of, oh, Ken, they hang about with him because he's kind of certain way, or we think he's weird. Do you find that a lot of that cliqueiness could maybe sort of ruin it for sort of younger people wanting to come in?
The cliqueiness does, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm like you, I talk to anybody, you know what I mean? I get on with everybody. And if you've been a cunt to me, you can fuck off, right? That's how I work, I mean. The cliqueiness, that's always, especially in Glasgow, man, it's always been there in Glasgow. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? All these wee cliques. It's funny. It's childish, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
End of the day, that's what I think anyway.
Yeah. And I suppose my last question would be, obviously with the kind of climate, how the world is now, and you know, everything that's going on in America, and obviously what's going on in this country with the Tories and other things like Palestine, and you know, all these issues going on, do you think that's maybe inspiring people, old and young, to kind of maybe get back into the punk scene, or get into it for the first time?
I hope so. You know what I mean? Because you seen it back in the 80s and that way, when like the Clash and the Sham 69 and that, and X-Ray Specs played at Anti-Nazi Kings and all that. That was powerful, and it's about change and about doing the right thing, you know what I mean? So if things could get the right voice and it could be channeled in the right way and stuff like that, it would be good, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of shit going on in this world now, man. You know what I mean? But this makes it's hard about Glasgow. As it's a divided city at best of time through religion. You have a skinhead who's a Catholic, supporting Palestine, and you could have a skinhead who supports Rangers, supporting Israel, you know what I mean? Yeah. That's how messed up it is in Glasgow, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I've always noticed that in the punk scene. Like, for me, example, I'm not really football inclined, but, you know, I've got green hair, you know, and I get...
Well, you're a Celtic supporter.
Or just even in general. And I suppose I'm interested to kind of know about, in the sort of punk scene, sort of, and the oi scene back in the 80s in Scotland, obviously in England, it's well documented how, you know, football was a big part of it. Was it a big part of it here as well?
It was. It was a big part of it up here as well, you know what I mean? I mean, going to the football, like for county, going out to Ibrox, and all these older boys for Easterhouse and Cranhill and stuff like that would get on the bus, and they were all skinheads, you know what I mean? Going to the Rangers game or going to the Celtic game or whatever. But then that all died out. And at one point, you used to get people standing outside Ibrox selling the British Nationalist.
Yeah.
Like the BNP paper and all that shit. You know what I mean? It's wrong. It's wrong.
Yeah.
They only get
And
away
that's-
with it now. I hope they
No.
wouldn't.
No. And I'll have this as my final question. What legacy would maybe you like to leave behind in the scene? Or what would you like to, teach people of any age or any background, or,
Do the right thing and don't be a cunt. Simple as that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Don't be. We're all Jock Thompson's Burns, you know what I mean? So it's simple, not us. And if somebody talks about any bands I've been in 30 years down the line, I'd be quite happy, you know what I mean? But, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Aye.
Derek, thank you. It's been absolutely brilliant.
The borough pal. Good speaking to you again.
Good speaking to you as well.
I think it's safe to say that each punk has his own introduction and entry into the punk scene. And I think it's safe to say that with the interviews we've heard from Alex, Chris and Derek, they all show a unique perspective in which how they got into punk and what punk means to them and where they think the future of punk in Scotland will go. I'd like to thank Alex, Derek and Chris all for being very, very great people and having their time to let me interview them.